clearly, I mean, you must be fairly consistent and persistent, Paul, for instance, to get to the stage where you are. Do you think it's a natural thing that has come to you, or was it something that you've really had to work on?
Consistency, I think we all have to work on. Human beings are consistent at being inconsistent, I think.
I like that. I'm going to use that.
But persistency is something I've had since I was a child, as my parents will testify to. Right? I never gave up. So when I was quite early in business, it's probably worth telling this story. When I was quite early in business, I used to export vehicle components, used vehicle components. And the difficulty was never selling them. It was an interesting business. With similarities to property, you know, it's not always the difficulty selling it. Sometimes it's the difficulty getting the product to actually sell at the right price. And there was a chap a few miles away from me. Wendy will know where this is, in a place called Kirkcaldy. In Fife, which is not a million miles away from where Wendy is, and he had loads of the types of engine components that I wanted to buy and sell, and many people had tried to buy these tools, these things off them. Wendy, I think you're kind of open on something, because I can hear or somebody's open on something. I use both open on Clubhouse because I'm getting feedback. Mm-hmm. Could you use mute on Clubhouse? Would that be possible? Could you use to mute?
I think we'll let Wendy mute and see if that's okay.
Okay, there we go. That's better. Thank you very much. So many people had tried to buy these components off of them, but it was one of those hoarders, which I think I've turned into in my old age, but that's a completely different story. And I went to buy them, and it was an interesting, we went into the office, and there was a kind of, if you imagine a long, narrow office, and on the right-hand side, there was a bench seat, and on the left-hand side, there was one of those little glass windows that slide like that. And the secretary sat behind the glass window, and all you seen was this panel and this little glass window. And I said, can I speak to Mr. Muir, please? And she said, what about it? I said, I want to buy all the vehicle components that he has down the bottom of the yard. And she says, I'll speak to him. So she came back out and she said, he's not selling them. And I said, okay, I'll see you next week. And the next week I went back and I sat down and I said, can I see Mr. Muir, please? And she said, what about it? And I said, buying the components down the bottom. I'll be sure. She said, he said last week he wasn't selling them. I said, ask him again. So she went back and he came back. She said, he's not selling them. I went back the third week, and by this time I was taking her a little box of chocolates because we became chums, and I was chatting to her. And in 6 months, I consistently went back, week after week after week after week. And I got very friendly with the secretary, and I used to take her wee gifts like chocolates and flowers and cake sometimes, and it was usually around about lunchtime. And eventually one day, after about 6 months, and it may have been longer, a wee head came to the window and opened the window and went, what do you want? And this was Mr. Muir himself. And I said, see the engine components you have down the bottom of the yard? He said, yes. I said, well, I'm buying them. We just haven't decided how much and when.
Wow.
And he did what you did. He laughed, right? And he said, come in the office. So he sat in the office and he said, what do you want? And I said, there was a particular model of engine called a Gardner. I said, I want anything with Gardner written on it, even a Welly boot. If it's got Gardner stamped on the bottom of it, I want it back. And he said, my daughter's about to have a wedding, and the kind of proceeds from this will help kind of pay for a good honeymoon for her. I said, fantastic. And I bought all of the components. And it's a long, boring story, and it goes on even more than that. And I turned out to get to know Mr. Muir quite well, who was a very interesting man. But 6 months it took to buy those. And that was a great lesson early on in business, I think, that persistency wins, right? And to give you an indication of the numbers on that, we bought about enough to fill 2 containers with those engines, which was about, in those days, about £42,000 for the 2 containers. And Mr. Muir took the grand sum off me for his daughter's wedding of £4,000. And that's what he wanted, because that's what paid for the honeymoon. And I said, well, there's £4,000, Mr. Muir. Are you happy with that? And he said, yes. And I said, and there's £1,000 gift for your daughter from our company for our wedding. And it taught me something, that persistency pays off, and it paid off big time. And I could bore you with stories like that all day long. In fact, somebody was asking me recently on Clubhouse, what's the longest deal I've ever done? And the longest it took me to buy a property is 6 years.
Wow.
Persistently, consistently approaching the seller, who wasn't a seller, who didn't have it for sale, because I've built a career buying things that aren't for sale for amounts of money people don't want to sell them for. Yeah,
I love that. So is it, do you think, just to sort of from other people's perspective, I mean, I think, you know, there's the odd person, wouldn't they, who'd go and visit and maybe go for a few weeks. So for instance, I know that I do and have done a lot of leaflet dropping for our, you know, serviced accommodation, whatever, you know, you arrive at a development site and I mean, I don't tend to do it myself much anymore, but we still, you know, consistently do it. And I remember sort of saying to them, you know, I'll be back, you know, next month. And they're kind of like, oh, okay. But obviously there were times when, because we were really busy, I wouldn't then go back. And you kind of think that was wrong. I should have kept going no matter what. And there was a number of them, and I would sort of keep forcing it. But inherently, if you were busy and there were other things that were going on, you wouldn't do that. Now, obviously, now we've got sort of more people helping us. We can be a bit more consistent in that approach. But you're going to have people that are thinking, well, you know, I've gone 3 times, I've gone 6 times. What's the point? Because in theory, it may never happen. Like you said, I mean, 6 years is a tremendously long time. What made you believe that it was worth that visit each week? Was it kind of like, if and when is the thought process, if and when he comes to sell, because it's going to happen at some stage, I want to be first on the list? Or was it just like, I'm just going to keep going until I've cracked, you know, I've knocked my head on the wall until the crack starts and then the hole erupted, which is what happened. What was your thought process?
As you know, I don't kind of focus an awful lot on this psychology, right? The psychology, I'm not really one of those, and mindset, right? In fact, the amount of mindset is on Clubhouse upsets me. But I've had this one thing since I was a child, which is once I decide something, it is. So when I said to Mr. Muir, I'm going to buy those engine components, the only discussion is when and for how much, I decided. Right. And it's interesting because I came from a very poor background, and I've got, I've got lots of siblings. And they kind of accepted where they were in life. And my mum and dad were very accepting of where we were in life. You know, I remember having a discussion with my dad when I was about 15 and telling him about my aspirations. And my dad said to me, people like us don't do that, Paul. So they were very much, well, listen, you know, I'm not going to criticise my dad. He had a life experience. He'd had 6 kids. You know, he kept a roof over our head and, as he would say, an arse in our trousers. And he believed that this was his lot. This was his life. And from about 12, I used to wake up virtually every morning and go, this is not my life. This is just not my life. And, you know, when you look at my son, compare it, I was brought up in the East End of Glasgow, and sometimes we didn't know what we were going to eat, and I mean that literally. And my son, you know, goes to one of the best private schools in Glasgow and wouldn't even begin to deal with the concept like most people wouldn't today, that there might not be dinner on the table at the end of the week. That just wouldn't even be real to him, right? So I think you get the life that you go out and take.
Amazing.
Not the life that it gives you. And as part of that journey and contradicting myself about kind of like, you know, all of this psychology stuff, I remember I've always considered myself in sales. I still consider myself in sales, right? I'm selling myself every day. And our business and, you know, our abilities and et cetera, et cetera.